My name is Hannah Whitaker, and if you think family drama means a few passive-aggressive texts and a ruined Thanksgiving, let me offer you a new baseline. 3 months ago, I watched my parents and my sister show up at a house with baseball bats, kick in a back door like they were auditioning for a low-budget crime show, and start swinging at a living room that didn't belong to them. They thought it was mine. It wasn't. That detail mattered to everyone, especially the guy who actually owned the place and the officers who rolled up 5 minutes later. I didn't learn about it from a neighbor or a group chat. I learned about it because a patrol officer from Lincoln, Ohio, called my cell while I was pouring coffee in Texas. He confirmed my name, asked me if I used to live at 842 Maple, and told me they had 3 people in cuffs who insisted they were my family and that I had ruined their lives. I said, if they're holding baseball bats in someone else's living room, I think they handled that part themselves. You'd think I'd be shaking, but my hands were steady. Military training does that. You learn to separate what's urgent from what's loud. The officer explained there was damage everywhere: shattered coffee table, ripped couch, slashed cushions, framed photos knocked off the wall, a lamp bent like a pretzel. The homeowner had walked in on the scene, backed out, and called 911 from his driveway. The officers arrived to find my parents arguing about whether to spray paint the walls. My sister, Lydia, was the one still gripping a bat, breathing hard. That tracked. Did you authorize them to be there? The officer asked. No, I said. I sold that house. It hasn't been mine for weeks. They knew where it was because they hired a private investigator to track me down, and apparently the PI didn't bother to check county records for ownership. Silence. Then the officer cleared his throat. They're saying you owe them an explanation. That's funny, I said. They told me 5 years ago I wasn't their daughter anymore. If they change their minds, they can put it in an email that doesn't involve burglary. Life. The officer went quiet again, then said I might be hearing from a detective and that they'd need a brief statement. I told him I'd cooperate. After we hung up, I put my coffee down and stared at the counter. I wanted to say I was surprised. I wasn't. I was tired in a bone-deep way you can't fix with sleep. People always want to know how we got here. It didn't start with bats. It started with money. It always does. Years of it. Little cuts. Favors that were never favors. One person in the family who keeps choosing shortcuts, and 2 parents who keep calling those choices potential. Meanwhile, I was the ice queen because I had a budget. If you need context, here's the version that fits between the time a kettle boils and the time it clicks off. I served in Army logistics. My job was to make sure people and gear got where they were supposed to be with what they needed, on time, and without wasting the taxpayers' money. That discipline leaked into everything I did. I saved. I lived simple. I drove a paid-off sedan and cooked at home. During deployments, I banked hazard pay and ignored the urge to buy shiny things. I wasn't suffering. I was planning. The plan was a down payment and a modest mortgage I could sleep with at night. My sister Lydia had a different approach. She could make a pitch deck faster than most people make a sandwich. Coffee shop, app, wellness box, crypto something if there was a trend, she rode it until it bucked her off. Our parents, Gerald and Patricia, applauded every launch like it was a moon landing. When each one crashed, they blamed the weather. 5 years before the bats, I sat at a Sunday dinner in Ohio. Roast beef, green beans, rolls, the usual. Lydia brought a stack of charts about a delivery startup she swore would double anyone's money in 2 years. The timing was precise because my mother had already told her I'd saved $120,000 toward a house. It wasn't a coincidence. It was an ambush with mashed potatoes. They asked me to invest all of it. I said no. My father told me to get out of his house and out of the family. I got up, walked out, and didn't look back. That's not drama. That's a boundary. People hate boundaries when they're used to handouts. Fast forward. I left active duty, made captain, moved to North Carolina, and bought a small Craftsman with good bones and morning light. I liked the quiet. I liked hearing my own thoughts and not hearing my phone ring with demands. I met Marcus, who did a stretch in the Marines and now runs operations for a trucking company outside Dallas. He understands schedules, budgets, and consequences. He understands that no is a full sentence. Then came the email. Subject line: life or death. My mother's name in the sender field looked like a dare. The message said Lydia owed $150,000 to dangerous people who were going to hurt her if she didn't pay, and that I was their only hope. That was followed by a family meeting that wasn't a meeting. It was a coordinated guilt attack. Sell your house, they said. Save your sister, they said. You can always earn another one, they said. I reminded them they had cut me off. Somehow they forgot. I didn't sell my house because they asked. I sold it because I could read a map. They had my address. They had the nerve to show up uninvited, step over my threshold like I owed them rent, and tell me how many bedrooms I didn't deserve. My father grabbed my arm. I told him if he didn't let go, he was going to hear a dispatcher's voice in about 9 seconds. He let go, they left. The next day I called an agent who worked with cash buyers. It wasn't a dream price, but it closed. In a week. Cash buyers exist. They wire the money. Title transfers. Keys move. I boxed my things, loaded a truck, and Marcus drove out to help me cross state lines. If that feels cold, understand that safety is warm. So when the Ohio officer called to say 3 people were being detained at my former address, I had the bandwidth to answer calmly. He asked if I wanted to provide context while he had me on the line. I said sure. I explained the email, the debt, the pressure, the visit to my house, the way they stared at my furniture like they were shopping without a wallet. I told him my sister had a habit of describing civil lawsuits like mob hits, and that the dangerous people were likely an investment firm with a stern legal department. I could hear him typing. He asked if I feared retaliation. I said I feared repetition, which is why I moved. He told me the homeowner had photos and video from a doorbell cam and a nanny cam in the living room. He said the estimate on damage was already climbing. He asked if I wanted victim services information. I said that would be for the actual victim, the man who owned the house. He laughed under his breath, then apologized for laughing. It was a human moment in a ridiculous situation. After the call, Marcus set his mug down and waited for me to speak. I gave him the bullet points. He nodded once, the way people do when the facts are trash but the plan is sound. I opened my laptop and sent the officer a short statement with dates, the closing documents from the sale, and my current address. Then I sat at the table and looked at the 2 keys still on my ring. One was for our Texas place. The other was for a storage unit full of boxes with labels I could read in the dark. You learn to label clearly when you've shipped pallets in a sandstorm. The second call came half an hour later from a detective. He was polite, direct, and unimpressed by theatrics. He confirmed he had my statement and the closing date, asked me to confirm that I had told my family the house was no longer mine, and asked if I had any recent communications from them threatening me or demanding money. I forwarded the email string and a text my sister sent after the family meeting that read, "You can fix this, you just don't want to." The detective said that would be helpful. He said they'd likely pursue charges for breaking and entering and criminal damaging. He said restitution was on the table. He didn't ask me to forgive anyone. He didn't suggest I was being dramatic. It's amazing how clear things get when you describe them as crimes instead of misunderstandings. He asked one last question. "If they call you from here, do you want to be patched through?" "No," I said. "They have my email if they need to apologize in complete sentences." I kept my voice even. Rage wastes energy. Documentation saves it. I hung up and finally took a sip of coffee. It had gone cold. I put it in the microwave, pressed 30 seconds, and leaned against the counter while it spun. There was a time I would have stood there shaking, replaying the past, bargaining with ghosts. That time is over. Boundaries aren't walls. They're doors with locks that you control. You don't need permission to use them, and you don't need a family vote to keep them closed when the people on the porch are holding bats. The microwave beeped, and I pulled out the mug, took a careful sip, and let the taste remind me of the mornings that had trained me to live without excess. Most people think the army teaches you to shoot and march. What it really drills into you is how to do more with less, and how to keep moving when everything around you is loud, hot, and falling apart. That discipline doesn't leave when you take the uniform off, and it's exactly why I'd been able to save the kind of money my family wanted to hijack. 5 years back, I was on deployment. Picture a flat desert base where the sun hits you before you even leave the tent. Our living quarters were plywood rooms jammed inside shipping containers. The air conditioning wheezed more than it worked, and you learned to sleep in sweat. Every soldier I knew had a small comfort they paid for. New headphones, a game console, a better mattress pad. I skipped all that. My comfort was watching the balance in my savings account climb every month. Hazard pay wasn't a gift, it was an opportunity, and I wasn't going to waste it. Most nights I was in the logistics tent with 2 screens glowing, juggling convoy schedules, supply drops, and repair requests. While others dreamed about spending money back home, I did the math. Rent for a studio in North Carolina. Average home prices around Raleigh. Mortgage rates. I tracked every number like it was mission data. And when you're surrounded by noise radios crackling, generators rattling, it actually feels good to have something orderly to hold on to. My unit gave me plenty of reasons to stay focused. Trucks broke down in the worst places, pallets went missing, and someone always needed a replacement part yesterday. My job was to cut through the chaos, make sure people got what they needed, and never waste supplies. It's the kind of work that looks invisible when it's done right. But that invisibility trains you for civilian life too. Saving money isn't glamorous. Nobody claps when you skip takeout or wear boots until the soles give out. But those quiet choices stack up the way supply crates do, one after another until you've built a wall high enough to keep the wolves out. When I finally rotated back home after that deployment, I rented a studio apartment so small the oven door couldn't open all the way without hitting the fridge. My friends bought SUVs and flat-screen TVs. I bought beans, rice, and secondhand furniture. I told myself every dollar had a job, and its job was to buy me freedom later. Not freedom in the patriotic slogan sense, freedom like knowing no one could tell me where to sleep or if I deserved a roof over my head. I remember one Friday night at the base when some of the others were planning a weekend trip, talking about hotel pools and steak dinners. One of them asked if I ever felt left out. I shrugged and said, "I'm saving for a house." He laughed like it was the dullest thing he'd ever heard. 2 years later, he was complaining about credit card debt while I was running numbers with a mortgage broker. I didn't feel dull. I felt steady. Steadiness was what my sister never had. Lydia treated money like it came with a reset button. When her cafe failed, she called it a learning experience. When the app tanked, she blamed the investors. Every flop became someone else's fault. Meanwhile, my parents nodded and said she had potential. They weren't wrong. She had potential to burn through cash faster than gasoline on a bonfire. But potential isn't equity, and you can't deposit it in a bank. What stung wasn't her failure. Failure happens. What stung was how openly my parents compared us. Hannah the saver, cold and boring. Lydia the dreamer, special and misunderstood. If you measured love in applause, Lydia was drowning in it. If you measured it in consistency, she was starving. And if you measured it in guilt, I was the buffet. There was one night I remember clearly, sitting on the floor of that studio apartment, eating canned chili straight from the pot, because I didn't want to wash extra dishes. I had spreadsheets open on my laptop, pay stubs, tax returns, interest rates. I looked around at my thrift store lamp, the chip table, the mattress on the floor. Most people would have called it depressing. I called it evidence. Evidence that I could say no when someone dangled shiny bait. Evidence that I was building something that couldn't be repossessed when a startup tanked. The Army had taught me to inventory everything, and I inventoried my life the same way. Money in, money out, risk here, reward there. That's why the request at that family dinner hit me so hard. It wasn't just a bad idea. It was an insult to every bean dinner, every cold shower, every hour I'd spent sweating under a desert sun telling myself it was worth it. To them, my sacrifice was just a pot of gold sitting there waiting for Lydia's next rainbow. To me, it was the one thing that proved my choices weren't pointless. Even now, when people ask me how I kept my cool when my family tried to bulldoze my boundaries, I think back to that desert base. Convoys don't care if you're tired. Supply lines don't pause because you'd rather be at a pool. You learn to plan, to anticipate, to keep going until the job is done. That's what saving for the house was. A long mission nobody else clapped for. And like every mission, it built muscle memory. When my parents tried to guilt me, that same muscle memory kicked in. Stay calm. Stick to the plan. Don't waste supplies. Supplies meaning time, money, or sanity. I don't claim I was immune to doubt. There were nights I stared at the ceiling in that shoebox apartment, wondering if I was just being stubborn, if maybe my parents were right that Lydia was destined for greatness and I was just destined to count pennies. But then payday hit, I moved another chunk into savings, and the numbers didn't lie. Numbers are stubborn too, and they don't play favorites. By the time I reached my goal, I had a down payment that would cover a solid craftsman house in North Carolina with money left for closing costs. I had proof that sacrifice translates into square footage, that boring choices stack into brick walls. And I had the confidence that comes from knowing you earned every inch of it without borrowing from anyone who could later call in a favor. So when the day finally came to tour that craftsman, the one with the hardwood floors and the morning light in the kitchen, I didn't see a house. I saw every night in a desert tent when I told myself it was worth it. I saw every meal of beans and rice. I saw every skipped weekend trip. The realtor thought I was quiet because I was doing math. I was quiet because I already knew the math worked. Walking through that front door, I didn't think about furniture or paint colors. I thought about keys, about how soon one of them would be mine and no one else's. About how once it was in my pocket, there wouldn't be a single person, sister, parent, or otherwise who could demand to hold it unless I chose to hand it over. That choice was mine, and I had earned it. The first time I walked through that front door with the keys in my pocket, I knew I had something nobody in my family could take away. At least, that's what I thought. A few weeks before closing on the house, I drove back to Ohio for one of those obligatory Sunday dinners. My parents insisted on the family tradition, and I figured it was easier to keep the peace for one night than deal with the fallout of saying no. That's how manipulation works. It sneaks in under the label of tradition. 1. The drive up was uneventful, just long stretches of highway and the radio fading in and out. By the time I pulled into their driveway, I had rehearsed my usual lines. Work is fine, deployment was fine, yes, I'm eating enough, yes, I'm still single, no, I don't need help. I walked inside and was hit with the smell of my mom's meatloaf and the sound of my dad complaining about his back, the usual script. Everything looked normal, but something about the way my parents avoided eye contact put me on alert. I spotted Lydia and her husband Caleb in the corner of the living room. They were whispering, heads together like two middle school kids about to prank the teacher. Lydia had a folder in her lap, and Caleb looked way too smug for a guy who had burned through 2 failed business ventures already. Dinner started the usual way, small talk. My dad griping about the neighbor's dog. My mom asking if the army was still dangerous, as if war zones ever turned into summer camps. I was halfway through my plate when my mom cleared her throat. She looked like a substitute teacher about to introduce a group project nobody wanted. Lydia has some exciting news to share, she said, her eyes darting toward me in a way that made my stomach tighten. Lydia straightened, smoothed the folder on her lap, and started a presentation that would have looked more at home in a boardroom than at a family table. She passed out printed charts, graphs, and revenue projections like she was pitching to Shark Tank. Caleb chimed in every few minutes with a nod and some buzzwords he clearly didn't understand. The idea was a delivery startup, something about combining gig drivers with local stores. They had projections showing doubled investments in 2 years. They also had that look in their eyes, the mix of desperation and delusion you see in people who are already in too deep but think one more roll of the dice will save them. I listened, nodded politely, and waited for the part I knew was coming. When Lydia finally dropped the line, it landed with the subtlety of a grenade. All we need is some initial capital, and Mom mentioned you've been saving. The table went quiet. My fork clinked against the plate louder than it should have. They weren't even pretending this was casual. My savings had been discussed, calculated, and marked as family property. I looked around the table. My dad wouldn't meet my eyes. My mom gave me that pleading look like she was auditioning for an after-school special. Caleb looked smug, like he'd already cashed the check. Lydia leaned forward with that syrupy voice she used when she wanted something. You've always been so good with money, Hannah. This is your chance to invest in family. If you put in your $120,000, we can turn it into $240,000 in 2 years. You'll get an even better house than the one you're saving for. I couldn't help it, I laughed. Not a happy laugh. More like the laugh you let out when someone suggests you jump off a bridge because they heard there's treasure at the bottom. Lydia, you've already failed twice. You're asking me to risk everything I've worked for so you can try a third time. That's not investing, that's burning money for fun. Her face crumpled like I'd slapped her. Caleb puffed up and called me heartless. My mom's voice turned icy. How could you be so cruel to your sister? She's more talented than you'll ever be. You're just jealous of her success. Success? The word rang in my head like a bad joke. Lydia's success had already cost my parents a remortgaged house, stacks of unpaid bills, and more stress than they could handle. But somehow, I was the villain for not handing over my entire future. Then my dad delivered the knockout blow. He set down his fork, looked at me with that hard stare I'd only seen a few times growing up, and said, "You give your sister that money, or you're no longer part of this family." It was like someone flipped a switch. For 28 years I had been their daughter. In that moment, I was downgraded to a walking ATM. No loyalty, no love, just a bank account with legs. I pushed my chair back and stood. My hands didn't shake. "I'm not giving her my money," I said. "If that means I'm not part of this family, fine." The silence was heavier than the heat in the desert. Lydia burst into tears and ran from the table like we were kids again. Caleb called me selfish and followed her. My mom's face was stone. My dad pointed at the door. "Get out. Don't come back." So, I left. No dramatic pause, no begging for them to reconsider. Just walked out into the driveway, got in my car, and drove away. I changed my phone number the next day. Boundaries aren't pretty, but they're effective. Sitting in that tiny apartment later, surrounded by thrift store furniture and spreadsheets, I told myself something I'd never said out loud. I didn't lose a family that night. I lost creditors disguised as relatives. And if they didn't want me as their daughter unless I was willing to sacrifice everything, then I'd finally saved more than money. I'd saved myself. The car ride back to my apartment that night felt like crossing into a different country. The streets looked the same, but the way I saw everything had shifted. Up until that dinner, I had always believed some part of me could win my parents' respect if I just stayed steady and kept proving myself. Walking out of their house after being told I wasn't family anymore erased that illusion like wiping a chalkboard clean. When I got to my building, I sat in the car with the engine off, listening to the tick of cooling metal. I replayed the words in my head. "Give her the money, or you're no longer our daughter." I wanted to feel devastated. What I felt instead was hollow, like I'd been drafted into a game I never agreed to play and then disqualified for not throwing the match. Inside my apartment, I grabbed my phone and stared at the family group chat. Dozens of photos, inside jokes, birthday messages. For a second, I thought about typing something, some final statement to make them see my side. But then I scrolled up through months of texts that were basically reminders of Lydia's great ideas and my parents' cheerleading. It wasn't a group chat. It was a fan club with 1 star and 2 stage parents. I deleted it, blocked all 3 numbers, and shut my laptop. The next morning, I marched into the base admin office and filled out a form to change my emergency contacts. I wrote down a fellow officer I trusted and left the family section blank. The clerk glanced at the paper and raised an eyebrow. I just said, "They're not reliable." She nodded like she'd heard that before, because she probably had. Cutting ties with family doesn't come with a manual. Nobody hands you a checklist that says, "Step 1, cancel holiday visits. Step 2, stop pretending birthdays matter. Step 3, brace for guilt emails." You just start removing them from your life one piece at a time until the silence feels normal. The first weekend after that dinner, I stayed in my apartment, cooked pasta on the one burner that actually worked, and forced myself not to wonder what they were doing back in Ohio. Whenever my thoughts drifted, I opened my savings spreadsheet instead. Numbers were solid. People could twist themselves into knots, but math stayed still. Work made it easier. In logistics, you don't get to sulk because someone hurt your feelings. Trucks still need to roll, supplies still need to move, and someone has to check every box twice. My colleagues noticed I was quieter, but in the Army, quiet just reads as focused. Nobody asked questions, and I was grateful. The hardest part was the old traditions. Every Sunday, I used to call my mom while I did laundry. I'd listen to her chatter about neighbors, church, gossip, whatever. Suddenly, Sunday rolled around and there was no call. I stood by the washing machine with a damp pile of uniforms and felt the weight of silence pressing down. Then I reminded myself she'd already told me the price of admission for those calls, $120,000. I threw the clothes in, slammed the lid, and let the machine rattle the guilt out of the room. I thought maybe extended relatives would reach out. Maybe an aunt or cousin would ask why I wasn't showing up to gatherings. Nobody did. Lydia had always been the center of attention, and I was the background noise. If I was missing, they probably didn't notice until someone needed a bill paid. Months went by, then a year. I built routines that didn't leave space for them. Morning runs, long work shifts, late nights with spreadsheets and job applications for when I eventually left active duty. The more time passed, the less I thought about them. I wasn't angry, I was uninterested, and that indifference felt like armor. Every now and then, someone on base would talk about their family visiting, or complain about their mom calling too often, and I'd smile and nod. I didn't tell them my parents had cut me off like canceling a subscription service. I just said my family and I weren't close. That was enough. The only time the separation really hit me hard was during ceremonies. Promotions, retirements, homecomings, everyone had parents or siblings in the bleachers, cheering, taking pictures. When I pinned on captain bars, my commanding officer shook my hand and smiled for the photo, but the stands behind him were empty for me. Later that night, a friend asked if it bothered me. I told him the truth. It used to. Now it just proved my point. I didn't need a cheering section. I needed stability. And stability came from refusing to play the role they'd assigned me. The walking bank account. The backup plan for Lydia's mess. They could keep their drama. I was keeping my savings. Still, there were moments that crept in when I wasn't on guard. Lying awake at night, I'd remember childhood trips, birthday cakes, Christmas mornings. I'd hear my dad's laugh or my mom's voice calling us in for dinner. Then the memory of that dinner in Ohio would cut through like a blade. The demand, the ultimatum, the door closing behind me. Those memories stacked against each other, good versus bad, but the bad always won because it was fresher and sharper. By the second year, the ache dulled. I had my own milestones, new assignments, professional courses, savings growing faster than I expected. Every time I logged into my bank account, it was like a private victory parade. Nobody could demand those numbers from me. Nobody could guilt them out of existence. One night, sitting in my apartment after a 12-hour shift, I realized I hadn't thought about Lydia in weeks. It hit me like a quiet revelation. The person who had dominated every family conversation, every parental worry, every dinner table drama, she was gone from my daily life, and I didn't miss her. The Army teaches you about missions. You plan, you execute, you adapt, you finish. Family had been a mission I never signed up for, and walking away was the only way to complete it. So I stayed the course, kept stacking savings, and kept my distance. What surprised me most wasn't how much I'd lost, but how much I'd gained. Peace. Space. A life where no one called me selfish for saying no. A life where family wasn't a word loaded with invoices and ultimatums. For the first time in years, I could breathe without waiting for the next demand. And that freedom carried me forward, one steady step at a time, into a future I was building entirely on my own terms. The years slipped into a rhythm, and by the time 5 had passed since that night in Ohio, I was no longer the woman sitting in a studio apartment eating canned chili over spreadsheets. I'd finished my contract, pinned on captain, and transitioned out of active duty. My final days in uniform were less about ceremony and more about paperwork. But walking out of the base for the last time felt like stepping into the life I'd been planning for all along. With the Army behind me and a sizable nest egg in the bank, I started house hunting in North Carolina. I wasn't chasing square footage or curb appeal. I wanted something practical. 3 bedrooms, solid bones, hardwood floors, a kitchen with real light instead of flickering bulbs. When I found it, a craftsman tucked into a quiet neighborhood in Raleigh, I knew it was mine before I even finished the tour. The realtor kept pointing out features, but all I saw was space I had earned. I signed the papers with a pen that barely shook, slid the keys into my pocket, and stood in the doorway for a long minute just breathing. That house became my sanctuary. I set up a small home office in the spare bedroom with a desk that didn't wobble and a chair that didn't squeak. I painted the kitchen cabinets myself, cursed at the hardware, and then stood back to admire how sunlight bounced off the fresh coat. For the first time, I woke up without the weight of someone else's expectations pressing down. The quiet was mine, and it was glorious. Work came in steady. Logistics translates well into civilian life, and companies love people who can manage chaos without panicking. I picked up a contract job with a supply chain firm that let me work mostly from home. My days were filled with spreadsheets, calls, and the kind of problem-solving I'd been doing in uniform, except now nobody was shouting over a radio about a truck stuck in a combat zone. The pay was solid, the hours predictable, and I could log off in the evening without bracing for alarms. Peace has a way of sneaking up on you when you've lived without it. At first, I kept expecting the other shoe to drop. I'd wake in the middle of the night, convinced I'd missed something or forgotten a deadline. Over time, I learned to unclench. Coffee in the morning didn't taste like fuel. It tasted like comfort. Grocery shopping wasn't a mission. It was just me wandering the aisles and picking out fresh vegetables because I could. And then there was Marcus. We met through a professional networking group for veterans, one of those virtual mixers where half the attendees don't turn on their cameras. He was a former Marine who'd shifted into managing logistics for a trucking company in Texas. He reached out afterward with a message about how funny it was that we both had spent years moving other people's stuff, and now we're trying to figure out how to move our own lives forward. I laughed, wrote back, and a conversation that started with cargo routes turned into long calls about everything else. At first it was casual, just two vets comparing scars and swapping jokes about military bureaucracy. Then he visited North Carolina. He was taller than I expected, with a dry sense of humor that matched mine, and the kind of calm presence that made even silence feel comfortable. We went out for barbecue, walked around town, and by the end of the weekend, the long-distance thing didn't seem so impractical. Our relationship grew in the same steady way I'd built my house. Calls, visits, small moments that stacked up into something solid. Marcus never pressured me, never made me feel like I had to prove my worth. He valued the discipline I carried and teased me when I color-coded my pantry. He understood what it meant to cut ties with people who drag you down. His own family wasn't perfect either, but he'd figured out long ago that blood doesn't guarantee loyalty. It was with Marcus that I first voiced what I'd kept inside for years. Sitting on my back porch one evening, watching the light fade over the fence line, I told him the whole story about that dinner, the ultimatum, and the 5 years of silence. He didn't interrupt or try to fix it. He just listened and said, "They cut you off, but you walked away with your dignity." That's a trade I'd make every time. In that house, I learned how much space peace actually takes up. The absence of yelling, the absence of guilt, the absence of someone constantly needing me to sacrifice. My family had once claimed I was selfish for protecting what I built. Now, every morning, I walk through rooms that prove the opposite. Selfish would have been torching my own future for someone else's fantasy. Protecting myself wasn't selfish. It was survival. On weekends, Marcus would fly in, or I'd head to Texas. We talked about the future in practical terms, where to live, what kind of work balance we wanted, whether we'd get another dog since mine had passed years ago. There were no wild promises or fairy tales, just two people mapping out a path like we were planning a mission. That steadiness felt more romantic than any grand gesture. One night, after I'd shown him the corner of the kitchen that caught the morning light just right, he leaned against the counter and said, "You built this life from the ground up. That takes grit most people don't have." I shrugged, not used to compliments, and he added, "You know, you don't need their approval. You already proved everything you needed to." The house, the job, the relationship, all of it stacked into a life that felt like mine, fully and completely. I didn't have to check my phone for drama. Didn't have to field guilt trips. Didn't have to pretend I owed anyone an explanation for the choices I made. My family's voices had faded into static, and the quiet was replaced with something better: stability, partnership, and the knowledge that I wasn't as alone as they'd tried to make me feel. Every day that passed without a knock on my door or a demand in my inbox felt like confirmation that I'd chosen right. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about living on my terms, with no one dictating the price tag of belonging. For the first time, the life I was building didn't feel like it could collapse with one phone call. It felt like bedrock, and I was standing steady on it. It was a Tuesday morning like any other. I was in the middle of a video call with a client, spreadsheets pulled up, coffee cooling on the desk, when I remembered I needed to check my old personal email. I rarely touched that account anymore, but I still used it for utilities and the occasional login that I hadn't bothered to update. I clicked over, expecting junk mail, and instead saw a subject line in all caps: "Life or death. Please read." The sender was my mom. My stomach clenched. and for a second my fingers hovered over the mouse like I was debating whether to open it. After 5 years of silence, this was the first thing she had to say to me. Not, "We miss you," not, "Can we talk," but life or death. I clicked anyway. The message was short, written in a shaky tone that practically screamed guilt trip. "Hannah, your sister is in terrible danger. She owes $150,000 to very dangerous people. They have threatened her life and Caleb's. We are terrified. Please come home. You are the only one who can help. This is urgent. Please don't ignore us. Hell." I read it twice, then leaned back in my chair. There it was, the crisis card. They hadn't spoken to me in half a decade, but now that Lydia had managed to screw up again, suddenly I was their first and only call. I wasn't surprised. If anything, I was annoyed at how predictable it all felt. Still, the words "dangerous people" stuck in my head. Even with all my resentment, a part of me couldn't just ignore that phrase. If she really was in danger, ignoring it would eat at me later. That's the twisted part of family guilt. They know exactly how to frame things so you'll feel responsible. I closed the laptop and walked out to the porch, pacing while I tried to clear my head. Marcus was inside finishing a call of his own. When he stepped out and saw me gripping my phone like it might explode, he raised an eyebrow. "You look like you just read your own obituary," he said. "Close," I muttered, handing him the phone. My mom emailed me. First time in 5 years. "A black man." He read it, exhaled sharply, and handed it back. Classic. They vanish when you won't give them what they want, then reappear when they're desperate. They're saying it's life or death. Marcus shrugged. So did every lance corporal who forgot to fill out their leave paperwork. Doesn't mean it's true. He wasn't wrong, but I still felt the tug. Years in the army had trained me to act when someone yelled urgent, not to sit and analyze. I wrestled with it for hours before I finally typed back, "I'll come by on Saturday. That's all I can do." Driving into Ohio that weekend, I felt like I was heading to a battlefield I hadn't agreed to fight on. The closer I got to my parents' house, the more familiar everything looked. Same corner gas station, same mailbox leaning at the curb, same house with the squeaky porch step. But the sense of home that used to live in those details was gone. Now it just felt like staging for an ambush. When I pulled into the driveway, 2 cars were already there. Lydia's new Porsche and Caleb's shiny Mercedes. For a family supposedly drowning in debt, they sure weren't skipping the luxury packages. I almost laughed at the irony, but the tight knot in my chest kept it in check. My mom opened the door before I even knocked. She looked older, more worn down, but her eyes lit up like she thought hugging me would erase the past. I didn't move. She stepped aside, and I walked into the living room. The whole family was waiting, like I was the guest of honor at a very depressing surprise party. My dad sat in his recliner, arms crossed. Lydia was curled up on the couch, mascara smudged like she'd been crying for hours. Caleb sat beside her, holding her hand like he was auditioning for Most Supportive Husband of the Year. I stayed standing. "You said this was life and death. What's going on?" My mom's voice cracked immediately. "It's about Lydia." Of course it was. It was always about Lydia. Dad cleared his throat. "Her business went under. The bank took the house. She owes a lot of money. To people who don't wait politely for payments." I turned to Lydia. "How much?" She whispered it like the number itself was shameful. 150,000. I let the silence hang long enough to make her squirm. "And you borrowed this from who?" Caleb jumped in. "Private investors. Not the kind you can negotiate with. They've been calling, making threats. They know our routine. They know where we're staying." I stared at the two of them, sitting on luxury leather seats outside and claiming they were terrified for their lives. If it wasn't so insulting, it would have been funny. "That sounds terrible," I said flatly, "but I still don't see what this has to do with me." My mom's tears kicked into high gear. "You have a house, a beautiful house. If you sold it, you could pay off Lydia's debt and still have enough for a nice apartment. You're young, you'll recover." There it was, the ask, wrapped in fake concern, delivered like it was a reasonable solution. Sell the one thing I had spent years building, the one stable piece of my life, to bail out the sister who had already drained everyone else dry. I scanned the room. My dad looked grim, like he was delivering a death sentence. My mom clutched a tissue like it was a prop. Lydia refused to meet my eyes. Caleb looked smug, confident this play would work. I shook my head slowly. Let me make sure I've got this right. You cut me off 5 years ago because I wouldn't give Lydia money for her last business. Now she's failed again, and you want me to sell my house to cover her mess? That's your pitch? Family helps family, my dad said. I laughed, sharp and humorless. Family? You told me I wasn't family anymore. Remember? You can't use the word now just because it's convenient. Lydia broke down, sobbing into Caleb's shoulder. I know we messed up before, but this is different. These people aren't going to take us to court, they'll hurt us. Then maybe you shouldn't have borrowed money from people like that, I shot back. Caleb's jaw tightened. You don't understand the kind of pressure we're under. You're right, I said. I don't, because when I'm under pressure, I plan, I save. I don't gamble other people's futures. My mom leaned closer, whispering like we were co-conspirators. This house of yours, it's just you in there. Too much space. You'll be fine in an apartment. I snapped my head toward her. I worked my ass off for that house. Every deployment, every cheap meal, every sleepless night, all for that. And you want me to throw it away because Lydia can't face the consequences of her choices? The room went dead quiet. Everyone stared at me like I'd just confessed to burning a church down. I grabbed my keys. If you want to help her so badly, sell your house. Or your cars. But don't ever ask me again. As I walked toward the door, Lydia's voice cracked behind me. You're making a huge mistake. These people don't mess around. I turned just long enough to meet her eyes. Neither do I. And then I left. The sound of her sobs following me out to the driveway. The slam of the door behind me didn't quiet the noise still ringing in my head. I walked to my car, sat down, and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. For a few minutes I just sat there, breathing slow and steady, like I was back in a combat zone trying to block out the chaos long enough to make the next move. My parents' words echoed in my ears, sharp as shrapnel. Family helps family. Sell your house. You'll recover. I wasn't recovering from this. Not in the way they imagined. On the drive back, I replayed every look from that living room. Lydia's eyes full of crocodile tears, Caleb puffed up like a con man with a good script, my mom leaning on guilt like it was oxygen, my dad delivering ultimatums with that cold authority he'd always mistaken for wisdom. It wasn't just that they'd asked me to sell my house. It was that they'd made it clear they thought my hard work, my sacrifices, and my independence belonged to them. By the time I got home, I had gone from hurt to furious. I paced through my kitchen, the same kitchen that had cost me years of sweat and thrift store meals, and thought about how they sat there acting like it was community property. My house wasn't some family bailout fund, it was mine. I had lived out of rucksacks, eaten MREs in desert heat, skipped every indulgence for years just to buy this place. And in their eyes, it was just a pile of cash waiting to be redirected toward Lydia's incompetence. The next morning, my phone buzzed. Not with a call everyone was blocked, but with an email from my dad. The subject line was one word. Disappointed. I opened it long enough to see the first line. You'll regret turning your back on your sister when something terrible happens, and then I hit delete. A few minutes later, my mom sent one that said, We raised you better than this. You're breaking your mother's heart. Delete. Lydia sent one too. You're the only one who can save me. That one didn't even get opened. Blocking them again felt like trying to hold back a flood with duct tape. They'd always find another way to push. By the end of the week, I was jumpy. Every knock on the door made me freeze. Every unfamiliar car parked near my house set off alarms in my head. I caught myself triple-checking locks at night. It wasn't paranoia. It was experience. I knew what they were capable of when they thought they were owed something. That Saturday, I found out just how far they were willing to go. I'd been out running errands, grocery store, hardware store, nothing exciting. When I pulled back into my driveway, I spotted a car I didn't recognize parked across the street. It wasn't one of my neighbors. My stomach dropped. I parked, stayed in the car for a moment, and watched. A man sat inside, pretending to scroll his phone, but his eyes flicked up every few seconds toward my house. I stepped out, slammed my car door harder than necessary, and stared at him until he looked away. My training kicked in. Observe, assess, control. He wasn't a random stranger. He was watching my house. I went inside, locked the door, and peeked out the blinds. 15 minutes later, the car pulled away. The following day, I got my answer. An envelope showed up in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. We know where you live. Stop being selfish. Help your sister before it's too late. I laughed, but not because it was funny. Because it was so predictable. When guilt didn't work, intimidation was the next move. The handwriting was my mother's. I set the letter down, sat at the table, and thought about every step that had led to this moment. 5 years of silence, and they hadn't learned a thing. They still believed they had leverage over me. They thought if they pushed hard enough, I'd finally cave. They were wrong. That night, Marcus called, and I told him everything: the email, the driveway stakeout, the letter. His voice dropped into that calm, serious register I'd heard a few times before. "You can't play defense forever," he said. "They're not going to stop. They're going to escalate. You need to make a move they can't undo." He was right. The army had drilled it into me. Don't just react, set the tempo. I'd been reacting to them for too long. It was time to act. I pulled out my laptop, opened my browser, and typed in a phrase I never thought I'd search: "Sell house, fast cash buyer, North Carolina." The results flooded in companies promising quick closings, no repairs, straight cash. Exactly what I needed. I didn't want top dollar. I wanted distance. I wanted safety. I wanted them to lose the only bargaining chip they thought they had. The next morning, I called one of the companies and explained what I needed. The rep didn't blink. "We do this all the time. Send us the details, and we'll get you an offer in 48 hours. 48 hours later, the offer landed in my inbox. It was lower than market value, but still fair for the speed and no questions asked deal. I stared at the number for a long time, then emailed back one word: accepted. It wasn't about profit. It was about pulling the rug out from under my family's manipulations. They wanted me to sell the house? Fine. I'd sell it, but not to bail out Lydia. I'd sell it to protect myself. That week was a blur of paperwork, signatures, and arrangements. The company moved fast, just like they promised. Within days, the house that had once been my safe haven was in escrow, soon to belong to someone else. It hurt, but not in the way my parents would have wanted. It didn't feel like a loss. It felt like a clean break. On the final day, when I signed the closing papers, I felt lighter. Not because I wanted to leave, but because I'd taken control. I walked out with a check, a stack of boxes, and the knowledge that my family couldn't touch me anymore. When Marcus showed up that evening with his truck to help me load the last of my things, he gave me a long look. "You ready for Texas?" I nodded. More than ready. Albly. We hauled the boxes out together, loaded the truck, and as I shut the door on the empty house, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. My parents thought they'd trapped me into a corner. Instead, I'd flipped the board entirely. For the first time since the ultimatum, I knew one thing for certain. I was done playing by their rules. Leaving the closing table with the papers signed should have felt like the end of the storm, but the reality was uglier. My family wasn't done. They had lost the chance to guilt me into selling my house for them, and instead of backing down, they doubled down. The first sign came the very next day. I walked out of the grocery store with a bag under one arm and spotted a car idling at the far end of the parking lot. Same dark sedan I'd seen once near my driveway. Same guy behind the wheel, pretending to scroll on his phone. He wasn't subtle, and he didn't care that I noticed. I walked straight past him, head high, and loaded my groceries into the trunk. My training told me, don't show fear, don't show weakness. He glanced up just long enough for me to catch his face. Average build, cheap haircut, a guy who looked like he'd failed out of law enforcement training. I wasn't scared of him. I was pissed at what it meant. Lydia had paid someone to keep eyes on me. When I got home, the envelope was already waiting in the mailbox. Same no return address trick, but this time typed instead of handwritten. "You can't run from family. We know where you are." I stood there on the porch with the letter in one hand, my keys in the other, and had to laugh at the absurdity. They disowned me, declared me not family. But now suddenly, family was their shield. Every word in that note stank of desperation. That night, I told Marcus about the sedan and the letter. He didn't raise his voice, but his jaw locked. They're crossing lines, he said. And you already know they don't respect boundaries. If you don't act, they're going to keep pushing until something snaps. We sat at the table with my laptop open between us, and he pointed at the letter. Document it. Take a picture. File it away. You might need it later. He was right. Documentation had saved my ass more than once in the army. I started a folder on my computer labeled family harassment and dropped the photo in. Over the next week, the harassment escalated. First, more letters. Then, a voicemail from a blocked number. My mom crying, saying Lydia couldn't sleep at night because bad men were calling. Theatrics, pure and simple. When guilt didn't work, they tried fear. 2 days later, I walked out to my car in the morning and found the windshield smeared with ketchup. Not subtle, not threatening in any serious way. Just childish and invasive. But the message was clear. We can touch your life anytime we want. I called Marcus and told him. He said, "Next move is yours, Hannah. You've got the leverage now. You've already sold the house. They can't touch that. But if you let this go on, you're basically inviting them to escalate." So I stopped reacting. I started preparing. I changed my routine, varied my routes, kept my phone on me at all times. I contacted the real estate company and made sure the sale was airtight, no loopholes for anyone to claim I still had ownership. I scheduled a moving truck earlier than planned. Meanwhile, my family tried one more trick, showing up. It happened on a Tuesday evening. I was cooking dinner when I heard footsteps on the porch. Not a knock, not the mailman. Heavy footsteps like someone had decided the door belonged to them. I peeked through the blinds, and there they were, my parents. My mom clutching her purse like it contained the moral high ground. My dad scanning the house like he was already mentally dividing the property. I opened the door a crack, just enough to let my words through. "You're trespassing. Leave now." My mom's eyes filled instantly with tears. "Hannah, we didn't come to fight. We came because Lydia is scared. I cut her off. She should be scared. She borrowed $150,000 she couldn't pay back. That's on her, not me." And my dad stepped forward, trying to wedge himself into the opening. "You're being unreasonable. You don't need all this space. It's selfish to hold on to a house while your sister's life is in danger." That was it. I swung the door open wide enough to make my point, pulled out my phone, and held my thumb over the dial screen. "You've got 30 seconds before I call the police, and when they come, I'll hand them the letter you sent me and every picture of that sedan that's been stalking me." Aster. The look on my dad's face was priceless, part fury, part disbelief that I wasn't folding. He muttered something under his breath, turned, and stalked off the porch. My mom lingered, whispering, "If something happens to her, it's on your head." "No," I said, "it'll be on hers." She followed him down the steps. I slammed the door, locked it, and leaned against it until their footsteps faded. That night, Marcus called. I told him everything. He didn't hesitate. "Pack up, sell's already done. Move out as fast as you can. Don't give them another chance to corner you." I looked around at the house I'd loved, the one I'd painted and furnished and claimed as mine. It felt less like a home now, and more like a battleground. My family had infected it with their demands, their entitlement, their threats. Keeping it wasn't worth the stress. The next morning, I called the moving company and pushed up my date. The man on the phone said, "We can get you out by the weekend if you're ready." I was ready. I boxed everything in a frenzy, labeling each one like I was shipping supplies in a war zone. Furniture, kitchen gear, clothes, it all went into neat stacks. With every taped box, I felt lighter. I wasn't running away. I was stripping them of power. They thought they could control me through this house. By letting it go, I'd cut the leash entirely. The sedan didn't come back. The letters stopped. Maybe they realized too late that their threats had backfired. Or maybe they were planning something worse. I didn't care. All I cared about was the moving truck that was on its way, the new life waiting for me in Texas, and the knowledge that I was walking away on my own terms. The day before the movers came, I stood in the middle of the empty living room, listening to the echo of my footsteps. This house had been my symbol of freedom. My family tried to turn it into a hostage. They failed. And when I locked the door for the last time, I knew I was taking that freedom with me. The morning the moving truck pulled up, I was already halfway through taping the last box shut. The air inside smelled like cardboard and Sharpie ink. The soundtrack nothing but packing tape ripping across seams. It was strange after years of protecting that house like it was a bunker. I was now tearing it apart piece by piece, turning my life into stacks of labeled cubes. The movers were efficient, the kind of guys who didn't waste time asking questions. They hauled furniture down the steps, loaded it into the truck, and worked with the rhythm of people who knew how to move fast. Every crash of a dolly against the floorboards reminded me I wasn't going back. Marcus arrived mid-morning with his pickup, coffee in one hand and that steady calm in his eyes. He didn't need to say much. He knew this wasn't easy for me. He just set his cup down, grabbed a box, and got to work. We moved in silence. The kind of silence that feels like support instead of absence. By noon, the place was nearly empty. I stood in the living room where sunlight used to hit the hardwood just right and thought about all the nights I'd sat there, convinced I'd finally built something nobody could take away. My parents had proven me wrong in the worst way. They hadn't taken the house, but they'd poisoned it enough that I couldn't keep living there without looking over my shoulder. Selling wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Marcus came in from the truck, sweat on his forehead, and said, "Last load's ready. You want to do a walkthrough?" I nodded. We walked from room to room, my hand brushing the walls as if I could imprint the memory one last time. The office where I'd spent hours on calls, the kitchen I'd painted, the bedroom where I finally slept without nightmares from deployments. Each space carried proof of my effort, but none of it outweighed the need to leave. When we stepped outside, the movers were strapping down the last of my furniture. One of them asked, "This everything?" "Yeah," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "That's everything." What? I locked the front door, handed the keys to the buyer's agent who had met us there, and didn't look back. The paperwork was already signed. The money had already hit my account. That house wasn't mine anymore, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the tension in my shoulders start to ease. Marcus and I hit the road with the moving truck ahead of us, his pickup following behind. The highway stretched out like a promise, each mile putting more distance between me and the chaos I was leaving behind. I glanced at Marcus, and he gave me a quick grin. "Texas is waiting," he said. The drive took 2 days with overnight stops, but it felt faster than any road trip I'd ever taken. Maybe it was because I wasn't running, I was moving forward. We swapped off driving, talked about the kind of place we'd look for once we got settled, and laughed about how I still labeled every box like it was Army-issued gear. When we crossed into Texas, Marcus honked twice and said, "Welcome home." His place wasn't big, but it was solid. A brick house with a fenced yard in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where neighbors waved but didn't pry. Unloading the boxes was easier than packing them. Each one stacked in the garage felt like proof I had carried my life intact across state lines. That first night, after the movers left and the garage was full, Marcus ordered pizza. We sat on the living room floor surrounded by boxes, plates balanced on our knees, and he raised his soda can in a mock toast. "To new chapters," he said. I clinked mine against his. "To shutting old doors." It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't some cinematic moment of triumph, but it was ours, and it was safe. Over the next week, I slipped into a new rhythm. Working remotely meant I could log in from Marcus's spare room, headset on, laptop open, the hum of his coffee maker in the background. In the evenings, we cooked together or just sat outside on the porch, watching the Texas skies stretch wide and endless. For the first time in months, I wasn't checking the driveway for strange cars. I wasn't bracing myself for letters in the mailbox. I wasn't replaying my parents' accusations in my head. The noise had finally gone quiet. Of course, I thought about what I'd left behind. Selling my house hadn't been part of my plan. That house had been my symbol of independence. But every time the doubt crept in, I reminded myself, symbols don't protect you. Decisions do. And the decision to cut ties before they could drag me under was the smartest one I'd ever made. Marcus saw the weight lift too. One night he said, "You seem lighter, like you're not waiting for the other shoe to drop." I'm not, I admitted, because I already took the shoe and threw it out the window. He laughed, shook his head, and pulled me close. That's the Hannah I know. In the quiet of that Texas house, I realized something important. My parents thought they could control me through guilt, intimidation, even harassment. But the moment I refused to play their game, the moment I made a choice on my own terms, their power evaporated. They could stalk, they could threaten, they could cry, but they couldn't undo the fact that I was gone, and I wasn't coming back. And as I fell asleep that night in a place where nobody knew my address except the person beside me, I felt more secure than I ever had standing guard over my old house. Because safety doesn't come from walls or locks. It comes from the choices you make about who you let in and who you shut out for good. Settling into Marcus's place felt like exhaling after holding my breath for too long. His house wasn't fancy, but it was steady, the kind of home that didn't carry ghosts. The first morning there, I woke up to the smell of coffee already brewing and the sound of him humming in the kitchen. I padded out barefoot, hair still messy, and he handed me a mug without a word. That kind of simple, grounded normalcy was something I didn't know I'd been craving until it was right in front of me. The garage was stacked to the ceiling with my boxes, each one labeled in thick black marker. Marcus teased me about how I'd written kitchen fragile on 3 different cartons, but when we unpacked, he admitted it made everything easier. Piece by piece, my life slotted into his. Dishes in the cupboards, books on the shelves, framed certificates from the army propped on his office desk. It didn't feel like I was intruding. It felt like the house had been waiting for both of us. Work continued smoothly. I logged into video calls, kept spreadsheets updated, and shipped reports without missing a beat. My clients didn't care if I was in Raleigh or Texas as long as the numbers lined up, and Marcus made sure I had space and quiet when I needed it. Some afternoons, we worked side by side in silence, 2 laptops open, the click of keyboards mixing with the hum of the air conditioner. Other times he'd wander in, drop a snack on my desk and say, "You've been glaring at that screen for an hour. Time for a break." Evenings became our ritual. We'd cook sometimes together, sometimes him grilling while I threw a salad together and then sit on the porch with the sky stretched wide overhead. Texas sunsets don't fade politely. They sprawl out in streaks of orange and red that demand your attention. Watching them with Marcus beside me made the quiet feel less like solitude and more like security. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was bracing for the next hit. No surprise visits, no suspicious cars outside, no guilt-soaked letters in the mailbox. I checked my email less, ignored unknown numbers, and felt my shoulders relax in ways I hadn't realized they were still tense. The silence from Ohio was a gift, and I wasn't about to return it. Still, the memory of what had happened clung like a shadow. There were nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene in that living room, my parents demanding, Lydia sobbing, Caleb glaring like I was the problem. Sometimes I'd hear my dad's voice in my head, "Family helps family." Then I'd roll over, see Marcus asleep beside me, and remember that loyalty means nothing if it's just a tool for manipulation. Marcus picked up on the lingering tension without me saying much. One night, after dinner, he leaned back in his chair and said, "You don't have to keep explaining it to yourself. You made the right call. If you hadn't, you wouldn't be here right now." I nodded. "It's just there's still a part of me that wonders if I should have done more." "More for who?" he asked. "For the people who cut you off, stalked you, threatened you? Hannah, they've had chance after chance. You gave yourself one, finally. And that's why you're standing." His words hit harder than I expected. Maybe because they were so simple. I'd been trained to carry responsibility, to take ownership even when things weren't my fault. But what I hadn't realized was how much of that had bled into my family life. How I'd carried guilt like it was standard issue. Marcus was right. They weren't my responsibility anymore. Life in Texas wasn't dramatic. It was ordinary in the best way possible. We went grocery shopping on Saturdays, argued over which brand of coffee tasted better, and laughed when my labeling obsession spread to his garage tools. We started browsing real estate listings in the evenings, not because we were desperate to move, but because it was fun to imagine a place that would be ours from the start. I found myself smiling more, not just polite smiles, but the kind that sneak up when you're not paying attention. I laughed at dumb jokes, planned meals without thinking about stretching every dollar, and let myself enjoy weekends without the gnawing worry of what fresh disaster might land in my inbox. Every so often, I'd get a text from an unknown number. Usually it was spam, but sometimes I wondered if it was Lydia trying to sneak through with a new phone. I never answered. Boundaries only work if you enforce them, and I had no interest in reopening a door I'd finally slammed shut. Marcus and I fell into a rhythm that felt effortless. We weren't living in some fairy tale. We had our disagreements, like when he thought folding laundry was optional, and I nearly lost my mind at the sight of a wrinkled pile, but even those moments turned into jokes. He'd call me Captain Organization, and I'd shoot back with Sergeant Chaos. It wasn't perfect. It was real. One evening, as we sat on the porch with the cicadas buzzing in the distance, Marcus turned to me and said, "You know, you've been through hell, and you came out stronger. That's not something most people can do." I shrugged. It's not about strength. It's about deciding I wasn't going to let them drag me down anymore. "That's strength," he said simply. The words stuck with me. Maybe I'd been avoiding the label because strength had always felt like something you proved to other people. But this wasn't about them, it was about me. Strength wasn't lifting for someone else, it was standing firm for yourself. As the weeks turned into months, the new chapter solidified. My boxes unpacked, my routine steady, my relationship with Marcus deepening. There were no more frantic calls, no more letters, no more late-night knocks. Just peace, earned the hard way. And even though part of me knew my family's chaos wasn't truly finished, the calm I felt sitting in that Texas house reminded me of one thing. No matter what storms they stirred up back in Ohio, they couldn't reach me here unless I let them. And I wasn't opening that door again. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was brewing coffee. The number on the screen had my old Ohio area code, which immediately made my stomach clench. I debated letting it go to voicemail, but habit won out. "This is Hannah," I said. A calm, professional voice answered, "Miss Whitaker, this is Officer Hughes with the Lincoln Police Department. I need to confirm a few details about a property you previously owned on Maple Street." I froze with the coffee pot in my hand. "I sold that house a few weeks ago." "Why?" There was a pause. Then he said, "Earlier last night, 3 individuals were arrested inside that property for breaking and entering. They caused significant damage to the interior. They're currently in custody." My pulse jumped. I already knew who he was about to name, but hearing it out loud still felt surreal. "Your parents, Gerald and Patricia Whitaker, and your sister Lydia." The room tilted for a second. I set the coffee pot down before I dropped it. "You're telling me they broke into my old house?" "Yes, ma'am. According to the homeowner, they were found smashing furniture and spray painting the walls. He called 911 as soon as he saw them through his security cameras. Officers arrived and detained them on site. They claimed the property still belonged to you and that they were addressing a family dispute." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's one way to put it." He continued, "The damage is extensive. Initial estimate is around $60,000. The homeowner is pressing charges. We're working through the paperwork now. I'll need to take a statement from you since they mentioned your name." I rubbed my forehead. "Of course. Send me whatever forms you need. For the record, I sold that house legally and have the closing documents to prove it." "I figured as much," Hughes said. "But it's best we have everything on file. If you have emails, texts, or any indication they may have been harassing you, that will help establish context." I thought about the folder on my laptop labeled Family Harassment. "Yeah," I said. "I've got plenty." After the call ended, I stood in the kitchen, hands braced on the counter, staring at nothing. The absurdity of it all hit me in waves. My parents and sister had actually taken baseball bats into someone else's home and destroyed it, thinking it was mine. They'd gone so far down the rabbit hole of revenge that they'd forgotten to check if I still lived there. Marcus walked in, towel slung over his shoulder. He took one look at me and stopped. "What happened?" I told him everything, start to finish. By the time I was done, his expression was a mix of disbelief and that steady calm he used when assessing a problem. "They could have been shot," he said finally. "If the homeowner had walked in with a gun, that could have ended in blood." I hadn't even thought of that, but he was right. Ohio wasn't shy about gun ownership. My family had risked their lives. And for what? To smash a coffee table and scribble obscenities on someone else's wall? The detective called later that afternoon for a more detailed statement. I sent over the emails, the letter from my parents, the photos of the car that had tailed me, everything. He listened without interrupting, then said, "This paints a clear picture. They weren't just reacting, they were escalating. The court will take that seriously." That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling fan spinning and tried to process what it meant. On one hand, I felt vindicated. For years, they'd painted me as the cold, selfish one. Now they were sitting in a holding cell, charged with felonies, while I was free and safe. On the other hand, it was crushing to realize how far they'd fallen. My parents, who once preached responsibility and hard work, were now reduced to criminals smashing furniture in a stranger's house. The updates trickled in over the next week. Court dates scheduled, charges filed, breaking and entering, vandalism, destruction of property. They made bail, of course, but the damage was done. Their names were in the local paper. Neighbors whispered. Whatever reputation they had clung to was gone. Friends from back home started reaching out. Some messaged me to say they were sorry I was dealing with this. Others just wanted the gossip. I kept my replies short. It's not my problem anymore. And it wasn't. The irony wasn't lost on me. My parents had screamed at me for refusing to sell my house to bail out Lydia, and then they'd turned around and destroyed a house that didn't even belong to me. Instead of saving Lydia from her $150,000 debt, they'd saddled themselves with $60,000 in restitution and legal fees. The math was brutal, and for once, it wasn't mine to solve. One evening, Marcus handed me a beer on the porch and said, "So what do you think they'll do now?" "Honestly," I said, "I think they'll do what they've always done, blame me." He smirked. "Let them. Blame doesn't pay bills. Restitution does." We clinked bottles. He was right. They could curse my name all they wanted, but it wouldn't erase the court order demanding they pay for the damage. The relief didn't come in a wave. It settled in gradually. Every day I went without a letter in the mailbox or a strange car in the driveway, I felt the knots in my shoulders loosen. For years, I'd lived with the dread of their next scheme, their next guilt trip, their next ambush. Now, they were too busy dealing with their own mess to chase me anymore. When the homeowner's lawyer contacted me to confirm details for restitution, I sent over everything I had and closed the file. My role was done. I wasn't a victim. I wasn't a participant. I was simply the person they tried to target and missed. And for the first time, I realized something freeing. I didn't need closure from them. Watching them face the consequences of their choices was closure enough. News about the break-in spread faster than I expected. Small towns thrive on gossip, and my family had just given them a buffet. Within a week, a friend from high school called me with the details that the papers hadn't bothered to print. "Your parents had to sell their house," she said. Her voice carried that mix of shock and fascination people get when they're watching someone else's tragedy unfold. They couldn't cover the restitution otherwise. Between the $60,000 in damages and the legal fees, they had no choice. I sat there with the phone to my ear, blinking at the wall. My parents had stood in front of me months earlier, insisting they were too old to start over, that selling their house was unthinkable. Now, they'd done exactly that. Except it wasn't to save Lydia, it was to dig themselves out of the hole they'd created with baseball bats. My friend wasn't finished. And get this, after they paid what they owed, they gave the rest of the money to Lydia, to help with her debt. I let out a sharp laugh. Of course they did. Because why keep a roof over your own heads when you can shovel cash into a pit your daughter dug herself? She lowered her voice. But here's the kicker. That dangerous debt? It wasn't loan sharks. It wasn't gangsters. It was a legit investment firm. They were preparing to sue her in civil court. That's it. No broken kneecaps, no hitmen, no threats beyond legal paperwork. The room spun for a second as the absurdity hit me full force. Lydia had manipulated all of them with a fake mob movie version of debt, and my parents bought it wholesale. They'd sold their house to pay off money she owed to a company whose worst weapon was a lawsuit. I rubbed my forehead, half laughing, half furious. So all that crying about life or death was just her twisting a court summons into a death threat? Pretty much, my friend said. Everyone's talking about it. Your parents and Lydia and her husband are living together in a cramped rental now. 2 bedrooms, 4 adults, constant fighting. It's a circus. After the call ended, I sat back in my chair and let the silence fill the room. The irony was brutal. My parents had demanded I sell my house to save Lydia, had accused me of being selfish when I refused, and then wound up selling their own house anyway, only to learn the crisis wasn't even life-threatening. They had sacrificed everything to bail her out of paperwork. Marcus walked in and found me staring into space. "What happened?" he asked. I told him everything. Halfway through, he shook his head and muttered, "Unbelievable. They threw away their security because she cried wolf. Vud." Not unbelievable, I said quietly. Predictable. And it was. My family had been running the same playbook for years. Lydia created chaos, my parents enabled her, and anyone who tried to hold the line got labeled cruel. This time, the difference was that I didn't take the bait. They turned their fire inward, and now they were burning in the mess they made. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. My house had never been the solution to Lydia's problems. If I'd given in, if I'd sold it, and handed over the money, they would have been in the same position anyway because Lydia never learned. She wasn't afraid of failure because she always had someone to cushion the fall. My parents were still her safety net, even when it meant cutting their own throats financially. A week later, another update came through a different friend. Lydia had blown through what was left after the restitution. The money barely made a dent in her debt. The investment firm still wanted their full amount, and now they had legal leverage to press harder. The apartment my parents rented had become a war zone of arguments. My mom begged neighbors for rides because she no longer had a reliable car. My dad was picking up odd jobs under the table just to keep food on the table. Lydia, predictably, was blaming everyone but herself. Hearing all of that, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. Tired of the cycle, tired of the excuses, tired of knowing that even after losing everything, my parents still hadn't learned the right lesson. They weren't angry at Lydia. They were still angry at me for not stepping in sooner, for not carrying the burden they willingly strapped onto their backs. But here's what stood out most. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty. Not even a little. Because the truth was impossible to ignore. My choices had given me stability. Their choices had destroyed them. There was no overlap. Their downfall wasn't my responsibility. It was theirs. One night on the porch, Marcus handed me a glass of iced tea and asked, "So how do you feel now that it's all out in the open?" I took a sip and thought about it. Relieved, vindicated, sad maybe, but not in a way that pulls me back in. Sad the way you feel when you see someone touch a hot stove after you warned them not to. You don't feel guilty. You just know they did it to themselves. He nodded. And you didn't get burned. That was the truth of it. I hadn't gotten burned. I'd sold my house before they could use it against me. I'd moved to Texas, built a life that didn't revolve around bailing out chaos, and put my energy into someone who actually stood beside me instead of dragging me down. Meanwhile, they were all crammed into a 2-bedroom apartment, drowning in debt, screaming at each other, and still convinced I was the villain. If that was the price of being their definition of family, I was glad I'd walked away. The calls from friends slowed down as the novelty wore off, but every so often another tidbit reached me. Lydia threatening to sue the investment firm back, which was laughable. My parents pawning furniture to cover bills. Caleb, her husband, working night shifts while Lydia ranted on social media about being betrayed. It was chaos on repeat, and for once, I wasn't in the blast radius. I thought back to the day my dad had pointed at me across the dinner table and said, "Give her the money, or you're no longer part of this family." He thought it was a punishment. In reality, it was the best gift they'd ever given me, because by cutting me out, they gave me the freedom to build a life on my terms, far away from the endless collapse of theirs. Looking around at Marcus, at the quiet Texas neighborhood, at the steady rhythm of my days, I knew I'd made the only choice that ever made sense, choosing myself over a family who never truly chose me. And the more their world fell apart, the more certain I became that I'd chosen right. The last serious attempt they made to reach me came through a mutual friend named Catherine. She called one evening, her voice cautious, like she knew she was about to walk into a minefield. "Your mom asked me to talk to you," she said. "She says they're sorry. They know they made mistakes. They want a chance to explain." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. They had 5 years to explain before this mess, and another chance after. Instead, they broke into a stranger's house with baseball bats. "What's left to explain?" Catherine hesitated. "She said they realized they handled things wrong, that they regret cutting you off." I let out a dry laugh. They regret the consequences, not the choices. If they hadn't been caught, they'd still be telling themselves they were justified. There was a silence on the line before she finally said, "Do you want me to tell her anything?" "Yeah," I said. "Tell her it's too late." When I hung up, Marcus was at the table across from me, watching. He didn't say anything right away, just reached over and set his hand on mine. The steadiness in that small gesture grounded me more than any apology ever could. In the weeks that followed, the attempts dwindled. A few more messages through mutual acquaintances, a couple of please call us emails that went straight to trash, and then nothing. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was clean. With the noise gone, I turned my focus to the life in front of me. Marcus and I were deep into house hunting by then, combing through listings in the evenings like we were studying maps for a mission. We wanted a yard, a solid kitchen, and enough space for the life we were building together. After everything I'd been through, I knew exactly what mattered. Not square footage, not curb appeal, but stability. My work was thriving too. The same discipline that once kept convoys moving now made me a star in the logistics firm. My boss trusted me with high-level projects, clients asked for me by name, and I finally felt like my skills were being used without being drained dry by family demands. For the first time in my adult life, every ounce of my effort went toward building something for myself. The best moment came on a quiet Saturday evening. Marcus and I had spent the day looking at houses and were sitting in his living room surrounded by papers and takeout boxes. He stood, walked over to me, and dropped to one knee. "Hannah," he said, pulling out a small box. "We've been building something real together. You've carried enough weight on your own. Let me carry the rest with you. Will you marry me?" For a second, my throat closed up, not from doubt, but from the flood of everything I'd been through to get to this point. The sacrifices, the ultimatums, the break-ins, the heartbreak. And now, here was a man offering partnership without conditions, without strings, without manipulation. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "Absolutely yes." The ring slipped onto my finger, and it wasn't just jewelry. It was a marker, proof that I had chosen a future on my terms, with someone who respected the boundaries that had once been trampled. We put in an offer on a house that same weekend, a place with a big backyard and a kitchen that caught the morning light. When the offer was accepted, I couldn't help but think back to the day my father told me I wasn't part of the family anymore. Standing there with Marcus, paperwork in hand, I realized he'd been right. I wasn't part of that family anymore. I was building a new one, and it was stronger than anything I'd left behind. Sometimes I still thought about them, my parents crammed into a rental with Lydia and her husband, fighting over bills and pretending the collapse wasn't their own doing. But those thoughts never lingered. They were like echoes of a storm long past, reminders of weather I'd survived. When people asked me about my family, I kept it simple. "We don't talk," I'd say. If they pressed, I added, "Sometimes the people you're related to aren't really family. Sometimes family is the people who show up for you without asking for anything back." That was the truth. Blood might tie you to people, but it doesn't guarantee loyalty, or love, or respect. Family is chosen in the way you invest your time and trust. My parents and Lydia had chosen manipulation, ultimatums, and chaos. I chose boundaries, freedom, and love. The army had taught me that discipline can save lives. What I didn't realize until now was that discipline can also save your future. Saying no to them, standing firm in the face of their demands, walking away when they pushed too far, that discipline gave me everything they tried to take. On the day Marcus and I signed the final paperwork for our new house, I stood in the empty living room and let the sunlight spill across the floor. It was different from the house I'd bought before, but the feeling was the same. I had earned this. Only this time, I wasn't alone. We talked about a backyard wedding, maybe kids down the line, plans that stretched further than I'd ever let myself imagine when I was still tangled in my family's chaos. The future wasn't a question mark anymore. It was a map, and for the first time, the route was clear. Looking back, I don't regret cutting ties. Not for a second. The hardest boundaries I set became the walls of the life I was building. And standing in that sunlit room with Marcus beside me, I knew I had finally found my real family, the kind that doesn't come from blood, but from choice. And that choice had set me free.